Welcome everyone to this explainer of Morgan Housel's absolutely fascinating book, Same as Ever. You know, you look at the news today and the world just feels incredibly unpredictable, doesn't it? Like it's spinning at breakneck speed. It's so easy to feel totally adrift. But what if the secret to navigating our rapidly changing future isn't actually about making better predictions? What if it's about focusing on what never changes? Today, we're going to explore how we can anchor ourselves in this storm of uncertainty by looking at the absolute constants of human behavior. I mean, the stuff that was true 100 years ago and is definitely going to be true 100 years from now. So here's our roadmap for today's deep dive. We'll start with the chaos of history and unseen risks. Then we'll pivot to the power of expectations and logic versus incentives. And finally, we'll cover the paradox of progress and how we can actually adapt to the unknown. Let's jump right in.
All right, Section 1, the chaos of history. Why we can never truly predict the future.
Okay, let's dive into this compounding chaos. We often look back at historical events and just assume they were completely inevitable, right? Like, of course it happened that way. But the truth is, history does not march in a straight line. It hangs by a remarkably thin thread of completely random variables. I mean, look at how tiny, insignificant events drastically alter human history. Back in 1776, a literal change in wind direction at the Battle of Long Island saved George Washington's army from total destruction. In 1915, the Lusitania slowed down just to save a little fuel. That placed it right in the path of a torpedo, which ultimately helped pull the U.S. into World War I. Or how about 1933? An assassin's bullet narrowly missed Franklin D. Roosevelt and hit the Chicago mayor instead. Just imagine how different American history would be without FDR's New Deal or his leadership in World War II. And then in 1962, humanity avoided full-blown nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis thanks to literal split-second individual choices. Small, random events just compound into these monumental outcomes. Which brings us to this really profound observation from Voltaire. He said, "History never repeats itself, man always does." And wow, that is the core premise of our explainer today. The external events, the winds, the bullets, the ships, they're wildly unpredictable. You literally cannot model them. But human behavior, how we react to fear, greed, risk, that is our one reliable constant.
Moving on to Section 2, Unseen Risks, the danger of what you don't see.
Because history is so inherently chaotic, our predictive models are basically flawed from the start. We plan for the things we can imagine, which means the absolute greatest threats to our stability are the risks we completely fail to anticipate. An unseen risk is exactly what it sounds like. It's an invisible danger that causes a catastrophic outcome precisely because the experts failed to predict it. Think about it. If experts see something coming, people prepare, and the damage is mitigated. The real danger is the invisible one. Just think back to the 2008 financial crisis. The entire system wasn't brought down by a risk everyone was talking about at dinner parties. It was driven by vulnerabilities that were either totally overlooked or considered, highly improbable by the absolute smartest experts in the room. The biggest risk is always the one you just don't see coming.
Section 3, the power of expectations. The gap between reality and our subjective feelings. So have you ever wondered why people living through objectively difficult situations can sometimes appear way happier than people living in absolute modern comfort? It all comes down to the happiness gap. By almost every economic and health metric, today's living standards blow the past out of the water. Yet we constantly see this fond nostalgia, this deep romanticization of the 1950s. Why is that? Well, because back then, the gap between what people expected out of life and what they actually experienced was just much smaller. Contentment isn't about your absolute circumstances, it's actually about the gap between your expectations and your reality. And that leads us to an idea that sounds, I admit, almost pessimistic at first. The first rule of happiness is low expectations. But honestly, it's actually an incredibly empowering mental model. By actively managing your expectations, setting realistic benchmarks, actively practicing gratitude, and avoiding the absolute trap of constantly comparing yourself to everyone else, you actually take control of your own satisfaction. This is absolutely crucial, whether you're navigating your career trajectory or just managing your personal relationships. Section 4. Logic versus incentives. Why humans do crazy things.
If you want to understand why seemingly smart people make absolutely terrible decisions, you have to remember that cold, hard logic rarely drives human behavior. People will justify nearly anything, and I mean anything, if the incentives are strong enough. If the incentives are crazy, the behavior will be crazy. We saw this clear as day in the 2008 financial crisis. It wasn't just a lack of intelligence. It was a massive system of misaligned rewards that actively encouraged terrible risks. Plus, lived experiences completely override abstract data. If someone has lived through a massive trauma, like an economic depression or a war, that firsthand experience is going to shape their worldview far more powerfully than any statistical spreadsheet you could ever put in front of them.
And speaking of our very human flaws, there's a fascinating catch when it comes to genius. And the catch is, you have to accept the whole package. We tend to idolize highly successful people, right? We try to extract only their good habits. But unique minds think uniquely about everything. Take Isaac Newton. The guy revolutionized physics and mathematics, but he also spent a massive amount of his time obsessing over, of all things, alchemy. You can't separate the brilliant traits from the crazy ones. Extreme success usually requires extreme and sometimes deeply flawed behaviors.
Section 5. The Paradox of Progress. Simple Truths and Dual Mindsets.
Okay, so now that we understand these timeless human constants, our flaws, our expectations, the sheer chaos of the world, how do we actually use all this to navigate the future? Well, human beings inherently crave certainty. We hate not knowing. So we gravitate towards really complex theories. They're intellectually stimulating, sure, but mostly they just give us a false sense of control, and they totally obscure fatal flaws. In reality, the most enduring, effective strategies are just simple truths. They don't sound sexy, but they are broadly applicable, and more importantly, they work. In finance, it's not some crazy algorithm, it's simply spend less than you earn and diversify. In health, it's not a wild biohacking regimen if it's exercise and get enough sleep. Simplicity almost always outperforms complexity over the long run.
But here is the ultimate paradox of progress. To truly succeed over the long haul, you have to perfectly balance two completely opposing ideas. You must have an unwavering optimism about long-term growth and human innovation. You have to believe things will get better. But at the exact same time, you need a fierce, almost paranoid pessimism. You have to maintain a strict safety margin to survive the inevitable short-term disasters, shocks, and those unseen risks we just talked about.
So I want to ask you directly, can you hold both thoughts at once? Can you be highly optimistic about the next 20 years while being extremely pessimistic about the next 20 months? Having the mental flexibility to balance this dual mindset is literally the key to successful investing, business strategy, and personal development. Section 6. Adapting to the unknown, turning short-term pain into long-term gain. I know that looking at unseen risks and chaotic histories can feel, well, totally overwhelming. But humanity's greatest constant is that we adapt. We always have. In fact, we have to acknowledge that prolonged comfort actually leads to complacency. Just look at a company like Sears. They had massive retail dominance, they got comfortable, and they faded away entirely. Adversity is actually our greatest innovation driver. Historically, intense military stress birthed everyday miracles we rely on, like the internet and GPS. Because we simply can't predict the future, cultivating flexibility and resilience isn't just a good idea, it's the only true way to survive. To bring this whole explainer full circle, I want to leave you with this really striking quote from Carl Richards. He says, "Risk is what's left over after you think you've thought of everything." And wow, that perfectly summarizes the human condition. No matter how complex our models are, no matter how carefully we plan out every single detail, there will always be a remainder. That remainder is the unseen risk. And that is exactly why preparation, resilience, and managing our own expectations will always trump prediction. So, armed with these timeless mental models about human behavior, I want to leave you with one final provocative question to chew on. If risk is what's left over after you think you've thought of absolutely everything, what aren't you seeing right now? Take a moment today to step back, reassess your own blind spots, maybe lower your expectations just a bit, and prepare for the unexpected. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.